Good morning. Thank you all for being here. Thanks to my folks over to my left for being here. My name is Matthew Minch. I'm head of jobs and skills for JP Chase Global Philanthropy, which is essentially the bank's team focused on helping people acquire skills, credentials, and ultimately great jobs. And I'm a bit giddy to share the stage with these very accomplished leaders over to my left, who are exactly the right people to talk with us today about business-led inclusive economic growth, talent partnerships to build pipelines. And JP Morgan wanted to bring these folks together and have this conversation with you all that'll be recorded, I think, and shared with the world. To time with a paper we're actually releasing today called Business Partnerships That Grow Talent Pipelines. And this is an issue that matters all the way to the top at JP Chase. Our CEO, Jamie Dimon, is very vocal and active in supporting these sort of efforts. And he's very involved in the New York City Jobs CEO Council, which is New York's version of these sort of businesses coming together to build talent pipelines in cities. So he's involved in the New York one, and we have executives around the country here in DC, Columbus, Ohio, Chicago, Dallas, et cetera, who are committing time to make them successful, to make those partnerships successful, because we think they matter for the city and for economic opportunity. We're also invested significantly from a philanthropic perspective in those entities. So based on all of those experiences, as an active member of those and as a philanthropic giver, we're putting out this paper kind of as a statement of what we think matters and what we think works. But in brief, what you'll find is an assertion that businesses must be engaged in economic advancement, economic opportunity, expansion efforts if our cities are to thrive. And these regional talent partnerships are probably the best way to aggregate that engagement productively. But they're not all the same, even though they might look the same on paper. And so we highlight what we see as 10 critical enablers of effectiveness that allow the best of these groups to have outsized impact in their regions. But I want to hear what the folks to my left have to say about all of this, because we've got folks who lead these initiatives, we've got folks who fund these initiatives, we've got folks who support these initiatives, and I think they have more expertise on this certainly than I do. I want to start with you, Assistant Secretary. In massive investments over the last few years, just like so much energizing activity that's galvanized work locally across the country on economic and workforce development. And you've been able to lead that, but also then to go visit and see what's actually happening, what's enabling success where you're seeing success. So I'd love for you to ground us in all of this, because we maybe get lost in all of the work you're doing. But what have you learned about the importance of business coalitions actually driving inclusive economic growth around the country?
So thank you for that, and thank you everyone for being here. This is a timely and a very urgent conversation that we have to have. You're absolutely right. This has been a very unique moment in time, and when President Biden and Vice President Harris came, the administration started, we were coming out of the pandemic. There were so many things that we learned about the pandemic, gaps, places that just didn't have the infrastructure, how people worked, where people lived, what services were around. So the pandemic really helped us kind of clarify what we needed. And some of that need has been accumulating for decades. It's exciting, you're absolutely right, it's exciting. I came into EDA, and EDA was a very small agency, $400 million, and now we have $5 billion. But to ground us, the question really is, will we continue to be that type of organization moving forward? Because this type of work is not a one-off. It's not a one-time, or as they dramatize it, once in a generation. This has to be consistent, relentless, long-term, if we're truly going to change the dynamics of how, not only how we prepare the future workforce, but also how we engage with our partners. So I put that out there as a grounding element. Now, this work isn't done unless you have an incredibly talented team of individuals who are committed, relentless, and I have to acknowledge my colleague, Patrick Burke, who's here in the front row. So if you haven't met Patrick, he's amazing. One of the things that we also learned, and I'll end with this before we pass it on, is that we as the federal government at times can, and I'm being very diplomatic, can be very arrogant. Because sometimes the federal government believes, like, we know what you all need. So this was an attempt really to switch the script, as I like to say, and not have the federal government tell you what to do, but you tell us, what are the assets that you have in your community? What are the industries that are in your community? Well, how does the partnership look like? So the way that we designed these grants, very large grants, was really about listening and taking into account the uniqueness of each of the places, as well as the uniqueness of the industries. So what you're seeing now is under our Good Jobs Challenge, which was a $500 million grant, you saw that across the country, and I know we have some folks here from Washington STEM, we have Tampa, we have so many places that are doing incredible things. So to answer the question directly of what am I seeing, when I travel, and let me tell you, I live out of a suitcase, I travel this country extensively. And when I go to places where there has been a re-energy of not only upskilling, reskilling, but also tying the workforce and helping them pivot into the industries of the future, that's exciting. And I'll give you an example. I just went to Washington State last week, really pivoting into the next generation of aerospace. People who, there was a gentleman who was a truck driver, and he said, look, there was this opportunity, and now I want to change my career. You're seeing that type of engagement. So I'll speak more about it, but I really want to infuse some energy and excitement. You all are at the front line of how we're changing this economy. But we need your voices, because this economy cannot change without you at the forefront. If we do what we've done in decades prior, then this space is going to be playing catch up. And that's not what we want. We want to make sure that the workforce development community, how we train, is really leading in a very innovative way. So more to come, but let me give you this so you can think about it. The Good Jobs Challenge, we're going to have another round of Good Jobs grants that are coming. Not as much money as before. It's $25 million, but I want to put that on your radar so that you can hopefully drive you to our eda.gov website. But these are the type of efforts that we're doing, so thank you.
That's exciting. In my former job, I was a Good Jobs Challenge grantee, and it was like just so catalytic of so much activity in Chicago, so thank you for that well-designed program. The Assistant Secretary used the word front line, so Bamitra, I want to come down to the local level. There's good people in Tampa Bay doing good work. They've been doing good work. What uniquely is important about the Tampa Bay partnership and how it's able to move things faster or bigger or more inclusively? Like, why is an entity like Tampa Bay Partnership so essential there?
Good morning. Thank you so much for having me. We'll take 10 million of that in Tampa. So one of the things that makes the Tampa Bay Partnership and our region unique is a couple things. One, we have 8 counties in the Tampa Bay region. And it's like having 8 siblings. Trying to get everybody to agree on things is not always the easiest thing. And so one of the things that the partnership does, first and foremost, is to get us to think collectively and convene and activate us as a region. Because we're not trying to beat each other. You know, we don't want Hillsborough beating Pinellas. We want to compete with Austin or Chicago or, you know, Charlotte, et cetera. I should disclose I played point guard in college, so it's basically like being a point guard in real life. And so I try to get everyone to understand, first and foremost, that you're on the Tampa Bay team. But the way that we're able to bring that model to life is we have all CEOs and regional leaders around our table. So it's not just, you know, getting folks who are influential around the table, because we want influential leaders around the table, but we also need them to use that voice and have managerial courage to help us move the issue on the needle on the issues that we need. So, you know, what we do is we have about 45 companies that invest with us annually, everything from our sports teams to the utilities to the banks, and they represent about 140,000 jobs in the region. And it's really helped us become a more formidable region, even at the state level from an advocacy standpoint. So when we go to, Tallahassee, we go to D.C., we're not Republicans, we're not Democrats, we're not male, we're not female, we're not black, we're not white, we're just Tampa Bay. And that's really made a big difference for us in the work that we've been able to get done.
That's fantastic. I'm going to make sure you're on my intramural team next time. Or
More golf than basketball these days.
So, John, let's bring it back up to the national level. You have a great vantage across the country. You get to also travel and see a bunch of sites. What have you seen that's, again, like uniquely powerful about these entities that allow them to do bigger or faster or better work in inclusive growth?
Well, thanks so much for having me on this amazing panel. Just humbled by the work that you've just heard about, and that these two of my colleagues are leading. May just describe a bit briefly some data on the problem we're facing, in which then these promising efforts, including many people in the room, are undertaking. Just underscore this just extreme nature of the challenge of the moment we're in. We are, I think, as everyone's experiencing, at an extraordinary inflection point in the history of this country and world, with unprecedented pace of change in technology, economy, politics. And I think at the heart of it, what I think many of you and many of the places around the country we're seeing are tackling community by community, is this massive economic disruption and change in this country and beyond, but in this country for a moment. 2 or 3 data points. Raj Chetty, you've seen the research that Raj Chetty's done probably, but a few decades ago, 90% of people in this country were doing better than their parents economically. Now it's dropped to 50%. And for those without a 4-year college degree, a lot less than that. Another piece of data, just to ground us a bit, is a few decades ago, a family of 4 could meet cost of living, basic cost of living, live decently based on salary and earnings and comp in 40 weeks in a year, with 12 extra weeks to do some extras and pay for extra things for family and community. Today, the median is 67 weeks to earn the basic cost of living. And that's been decades in the making. Now, this administration, I think, in a bipartisan way, including Assistant Secretary Castillo's leadership, Secretary Raimondo's and others, has made really important strides in catalyzing and supporting work to address that. But that's the reality that our country has been facing. Third piece of data, I'm trying to confirm this. This first 2 I'm sure about. Third, I'm almost sure, but I have not seen the written source, so with a bit of caveat, but I've heard from a very respected source that after the Great Recession in 2008, that 50% of the new jobs, at least the decently paid new jobs in the country that were created after the Great Recession in 2008, were concentrated in 3% of the counties in the country for many years. So we're seeing geographic inequities. We're seeing the median person in the country struggling. At the same time, we've got, as you know, more open jobs than unemployed workers. We have this dual issue that many of you are experiencing, where we've got businesses in the economy hungry for talent to power the economy and power their companies. At the same time, we've got people who are shortchanged and looking for opportunities to get ahead and do good jobs. So we're facing this, I would say, almost existential challenge as a country, where if people don't feel like and see how they've got greater hope for themselves and ourselves and our kids and communities in terms of economic hope and jobs, I think we're going to have decreasing confidence that our system, our democratic system, works. And that's going to play out, and sometimes is playing out, but it could play out worse in ways where people then begin blaming each other and fighting and pointing and not building up opportunity for each other. So the stakes of getting this right, the growing our economy in different places around the country, and growing our workforce and talent to be able to power the economy, give people opportunity, I really think are at the center of what it's going to take to protect our democracy. I do think the Commerce Department has been, with Secretary Raimondo, Secretary Castillo, has been leading remarkably in that, with not top down, but catalyzing and supporting. We were at a conference earlier today that where 31 tech hubs from around the country are gathered, where business, communities, education, government are gathered, building out high growth sectors like drones, autonomous systems, and semiconductors, and battery technology, and having workforce talent strategy aligned. Like here at this conference, locally, there is this collaboration talent, but it's not at the scale needed. And the last thing, just to sort of address it specifically, and I can go more into the panel, I think the reality of the field and what we're seeing in terms of local efforts around the country is that we all collectively have been we've been moving ahead, getting better, while we've been falling behind. And what I mean by that, the falling behind is given this bar of change, like we're not keeping up, and actually these are slipping in terms of people being able to get access to the good jobs they need, even while we're moving ahead in terms of more partnerships, better evolution, businesses engaging. So the question is how at scale to get more dramatic progress to keep pace. And I do think this notion of the intermediary function in a very different way I think we've seen in the past, to really serve the broad swath of the population, not just the safety net that often the workforce development system serves, but the broad, not just the higher end employees that often companies are investing in, but the broad swath of the population to look at collectively, like in Tampa as an example, Washington State's an example, Career Connect Washington, another Good Jobs Challenge grantee, Miami's another Tech Hub winner that we're with today, has Good Jobs Challenge grantee, where you actually, employers are collectively saying, here's the target, here's what we need, and then it's a team sport, not an individual sport, as many of you know. How do you actually operationalize the supply of diverse talent to the needs, the demand of employers in a way that's iterative over time? And I think with that team sport, you need somebody to pull that together. And this intermediary with certain features that's different than we've had previously, I think is indispensable.
So we got point guards and team sports, and I want to stick with this, like, there's a new moment that takes a new approach for a second. Because, when we were writing this paper, could imagine some readers and some folks maybe sitting here like, are we just talking about workforce intermediaries or like local business entities that it's been part of the workforce like playbook for years? Like, how do they need to operate differently to achieve this team sport effect? And I'm curious, maybe Assistant Secretary, if when you're traveling around the country, if there's like ingrained habits, ways of operating, or mindsets that like have needed to change to meet the moment.
Yeah, so traditionally, I think to your point, we've thought of intermediaries in a particular way, but the moment does require us to broaden that scope. Not only are we looking for intermediaries who can bring people together, but intermediaries who can push the envelope. And let me just take a step back, because I also want to clarify, commerce, the Department of Commerce, traditionally has really not played a role in this space. But today, I will tell you, at least from the EDA perspective, all of our EDA grants have a workforce component embedded in it. And I also have to mention that all of EDA's grants are also reviewed under our investment policies, and equity is our #1 investment policy. Because it goes back to, if we're going to bring in new models and new forms of intermediaries, we also have to make sure that we're opening up that paradigm of how we approach this work. I wanted to piggyback on something that John also said, if I may. You're in Washington, D.C. I am encouraging you, for those of you who have worked with EDA or our Department of Commerce, we have to tell these stories. We have to tell the stories over and over and over again, the stories of success. Because, again, the model by which the federal government has approached this has traditionally lived in the Department of Labor, Department of Education. We now have this urgency to make sure that all of the federal government is truly focusing on workforce development with a different paradigm, because the urgency is now. At this moment, I'm split between two events. One is we're convening our tech hubs. So if you look at tech hubs, and I'm going to take a minute, tech hubs is really part of the CHIPS and Science Act, 10 different technologies that the federal government has acknowledged that we need to really lean in, both for economic growth and national security. And when we look at this broader, the broader vision of where we are as a nation, and John mentioned some of those metrics, where we are as a nation, one could argue that we're trying to catch up, but at the same time, we're falling behind. So this is all going to create a moment of a lot of change and a lot of uneasiness. It is our job to make sure that the work that we do is to help individuals really upskill, reskill, look at possibilities in those industries. Because if not, as was mentioned, then we leave people behind. We leave regions behind. And there's nothing that frays our democracy than when we have left behind, swaths of individuals. So I put that forward. I know that I spoke about the intermediaries, but I also want to invite you to think about, why is this important? Why is this moment in time important? And again, as I've said from the onset, what's the role you play, and how do we partner together so that this is actually something that we can get to the finish line?
I love that, and it reminds me of something Governor Westmore was saying yesterday around leave no one behind in this work. In that spirit, I'm curious, I'm going to put you on the spot here. Across the country, I don't know, let's say there's 100, 150 of these, 200 in some way, in different cities. What percentage are just knocking it out of the park? Like, these are fantastic, and then there's the rest who are like, they're helpful and they're getting there. Like, how much excellence do we see? It's kind of, how many people are we leaving behind?
I'll be very candid. We just briefed the secretary, and I would say maybe 5 to 7% are the ones that we are watching, but the rest are hitting it out of the park. They have been waiting for this moment and these type of dollars. We just need to make sure that we can continue to fund and direct and partner. But I will tell you, I am always in awe of what's happening across the country.
Share that awe, John.
I think two things are true. I think my interpretation is when we look at some of the Commerce Department programs like Tech Hubs, Good Jobs Challenge, from I think there were well over 300 applicants for Tech Hubs, for example, with a big focus on, again, growing technology, growing business, workforce at the center. There are 31 designees, 12 grantees, big grantees there, and my sense is the pool is deep in terms of the folks you've supported. I would say from looking at the over 300 applicants for that the percentage of the overall applicants that are even trying is pretty low. Not of people with individuals with good talent and good intent, but of people who've have built the capabilities as an intermediary and a coalition to leverage the moment. And I would say, my view from we've seen at America Achieves, we've seen a lot of communities interested in doing this and that aren't even really ready to apply for something like be competitive for a Good Jobs Challenge or Tech Hubs. And I think we're like 5% of communities are at the point. That's not a knock on it, it's just this is really different. And the robustness of the intermediary, the level of commitment needed from business collectively, and this is really where we are collective in terms of the targets for what's needed in terms of jobs and skills. Is actually being willing to actually share that collectively. So people often have proprietary information, but through making sure there's data on overall what we're trying to accomplish, but with real skin in the game commitments from employers, not just the table around the edges, but at the center. Having measurable goals and outcomes in terms of job attainment, job placement, wage gains, having an ability to actually then look at all of the different providers in a community and capabilities to say, given the skills that are needed, really, where are the different providers? Where are the community colleges? Where are the technical colleges? Where are the workforce development agencies? And really say, okay, where are they really? Not just in terms of having some decent work, but alignment to how people are hiring for. Having the data systems, the trust, you only can move at the speed of trust, the trust across different coalitions. When you look at what it takes financially, talent-wise, in an intermediary and a coalition, to really actually do this work at scale, not just like 10 good people trained for this here and 15 there for one company with one partner, it's just a new ballgame. And I would say my view is we're no better than 5%, even though the pool of kind of the winning grantees at a place like Commerce is very strong.
I love that. I appreciate you guys answering that honestly. So where we're able to support groups through Commerce's programs, fantastic. There's a whole lot of folks who are like, they're in the minor leagues maybe, and they're trying to get there. And that's, to your point, Assistant Secretary, this can't all be a one-off. We have to keep investing and keep moving them forward, and groups like America Achieves have to keep helping the ones who are ready and willing and excited about it, but just have some partnerships to build and some trust to build. I appreciate that. And so, Bamitra, when we think about this this question of the moment and change at the local level, Tampa Bay Partnership has been around what?
Since 1994.
1994. And is there a conversation over the last 5 years or so where it's like, all right, we've been great, but what got us here isn't going to get us there, kind of thing? What's that change you need to see?
Sure. So we made a shift in really how we do all of our work about 7 years ago. And to John's point, we realized that we were not doing a good job of working collectively as a region. We didn't have a measurable tool. We had a lot of silos. We had great, what I call, small programs where, like you say, you train 10 people, 15 people, that we weren't duplicating them throughout the region. And so we created a regional competitiveness report about 7 years ago that has 60-plus indicators that takes a look at how Tampa Bay is doing against 19 other markets from around the country. And the way we chose those markets where we looked at, communities that were similar to us in terms of assets, Also, we looked at communities where we were competing, whether we were winning or losing, with respect to what our EDCs were doing and our chambers were doing. And then we use that data to say, okay, what do we want to measure? Everything from educational attainment to transportation and infrastructure to economic vitality to, cultural attractiveness. And that's how we make our decision on what we're going to focus on in the region today, which our priorities are workforce, talent, transportation. What's interesting, when you talk to the other MEs around the country, we all kind of have the same focus, but for different reasons. So DC might want to have maintenance on their transit. We want to get transit in Tampa Bay, like that type of thing. But what it allowed us to do is to realize where our gaps are, and more importantly, how we could move together to build that trust. And like I mentioned, one of the first things that we were able to do is bring everyone together from an education, business, and local government perspective. We weren't doing a good job of that, quite honestly. You're not going to be able to compete for these large grants if your community is not already exercising the muscle of working together. You can't come together just to apply for a grant. It doesn't work that way. So I think, now our competitiveness report is a trusted data tool that everybody uses, our not-for-profits, our local governments, our businesses. And I feel like now that's allowing us to move from, at first it was like, what's the data? We were, I think, more seen as a think tank. Now we're seen more as a do tank and more of a convener. But having that data as a trusted tool was a very necessary jumping off point.
So having good data systems is one of the things we highlight in the paper. And another one I want to double click on there is the people at the table. We say it's critical to have the right people at the table who can make decisions for the business and can move big ideas forward. And I'll say, I've been involved in a lot of these myself, so I can say that sometimes, you've got all the logos from the companies on the website, and, it's frankly folks who are sitting in my seat in philanthropy or community engagement, which are great to have too, but you also need the folks who are from HR and are from the lines of business. We think that's critical, but I'm curious how you've seen that play out locally.
Yeah, so our model is to be on our board, you have to be the CEO or regional leader of your organization, and then we can put other team members from those groups in our working groups, our transportation working group, our workforce working group, our housing, et cetera. But you really do need the leaders around the table making those huge decisions of how we're going to pursue things, and then not just have them there, but they're willing to use their voice, right? So it's not helpful to have the CEO of ABC company if they're not going to say anything or they're not going to push the envelope. So as I always say, they have to have that managerial courage. And then the last piece I would say is one of my favorite books is Ego is the Enemy. Like, get everyone to kind of check their ego at the door so that we can work collectively on things. I think, coming from the banking, my background being in banking, we're used to competing. You compete on every deal. You're trying to do a loan for somebody, you're going to be competing with 3 or 4 other banks. Some of the other industries don't have that muscle of competition, and so you have to get them to learn how it's okay to share information. It's okay for us to, because again, we're trying to compete with Nashville, we're trying to compete with Austin. We can't do that if we're not sharing. So having data sharing agreements so that people have that trust is also very helpful.
Were you trying to jump in there?
Just to build on that, I think one of the key distinctions, we had a chance to look through a lot of the interested applications for some of these federal programs and people who are interested in getting support for those. At American Choose, we supported actually 6 of the 12 winners announced. 6 of them we supported. Two key differences that we see among some of the most promising applications and those who aren't, that from the commerce programs, but also I think that are relevant here. One is the nature of the employer commitment. And on one side, there's people at the table, they put their logos on, they may do a little bit around the edges. The other is where there's actual significant commitments of hiring or interview commitments, investment commitments, in kind. When you ask the employers in those places why they're actually committing in those places, Like, rarely is it because, I mean, there is a good citizenship for sure. People have an interest in but usually it's because there's a value proposition that's been created through this work that's actually going to address pain points of talent and needs. That's not just a one-off, but it's like overall, like, okay, our talent needs are going to be addressed here in this way. There's a value proposition that actually make it worthwhile. It's a good business investment. And at least, I think the theory is, but I think they believe it, to make these commitments. But the significance of commitments depend on the value proposition. And most efforts we see, there's actually not a value proposition, in part because there's often, the second thing we see is there's often, when you said this about Tampa Bay, there's actually all these piecemeal efforts, and everyone's pursuing their own interests. The best ones where people say, okay, this is Tampa Bay, or this is Washington, or this is Miami, or this is Wisconsin. This is like the North Star that all of us are going to subordinate some of our near-term interest in order to support the overall goal. So there can be a value proposition both for the workers, but then for the companies. So to me, that employer decommitment, that North Star, and then the only other thing I'd say, just for the moment, is even the best of these efforts are going to making progress, but I think there's going to be a ceiling on this without significant policy change, especially at the state level. And I think there are some states that actually are making progress, but I think that's putting a bit of a ceiling on. I think significant policy change that can enable and support these, I think will also be a key enabler of more.
I just want to jump in. A couple of things, as I heard, John, you mention. You're absolutely right. When you look at the cohort of grantees that we've been able to support, the metrics are really powerful. But to your point, John, we have to also look at the 530 who didn't get. And that scaling piece is a piece that is of concern from a national perspective and a competitiveness perspective. So we go back to this cannot be a one-off. It has to be consistent. The other thing I would say is you're absolutely right on the employer engagement and employer participation. That's what's made our Good Jobs grants so unique, because it's all about not just the training, but the placement. And it takes an army of individuals that we don't have, but we have very talented individuals who really test how authentic, how meaningful are these employer engagement parts of it. Because we've seen for decades that people do put their logos and that's it. But the secret sauce, I think, moving forward for the federal government is the coalition building. And that coalition building has to be very authentic. People have to put resources on the table. And we've had the experience where even applicants who did not succeed in getting the dollars, they do credit the fact that we kind of incentivize them to come to the table. And they've been able to move forward and secure other dollars. The other point, John, that you mentioned is, yeah, we're seeing states now follow the model as well, because this is not just a federal government play. It has to be at the state level as well. So you're seeing governors putting dollars to a much more innovative approach to making sure that we can scale. I think if you leave with anything, it's we have to scale this effort, and we have to do it pretty quickly.
I want to pick up that point around sort of policy and funding and scale at the state level, and a point I think you were making, John, around sort of the corporate contributions to this and the ability to invest massively in these projects. I think I've heard it said that ultimately the success of a lot of these commerce programs will be measured in how much sort of funding alongside the federal money comes from local companies. And I'm curious if you've seen anything, Assistant Secretary, that's unique when you go to these regions that have been able to pull in additional corporate dollars or are starting to have a productive conversation with the state about how they need to spend their money differently. What's the secret sauce in these local groups that have just figured out how to get that money into these projects?
I'm seeing a lot of, across the EDA suite of grants, I'm seeing that, one, the sustainability is also embedded into these grants. We are providing support for the first 3 to 5 years, but then the goal here is to make it sustainable, because again, we have to scale and there's not enough resources. That in itself has also incentivized at the state level, both governors, and I'll talk about the public sector, governors talking to the core base of their economy, right? So if you're in a state where it's aerospace, guess what? You're seeing a amalgamation of aerospace entities coming together, saying this is a need, and working very closely with our Good Jobs Challenge. But there's, to John's point, at the end of the day, there's a need, both in terms of the private sector and their bottom line, but also in terms of the state and the national level. But I do want to take a moment because I mentioned the word equity, and I think I want to anchor this. When we look at equity, we want to make sure that as we upskill and reskill, that we're doing this in a way where women can participate, where rural America is participating, where communities of color are participating. That equity piece, I have to stress, because if we don't do it at the beginning, then it's harder to do at the tail end. And equity has to be a driver here, because I'm not just talking about equity in terms of population, but also in terms of geography. This country cannot just be the coasts. It can't. It shouldn't. So I just wanted to recenter ourselves on how important that work is as well.